The September sun burned mercilessly over the arid lands of Maverick County when the stagecoach raised a cloud of red dust on the horizon. It was 1887, and the small town of Redemption Creek was living its most prosperous days since the discovery of silver in the nearby mountains. But on that day the unexpected arrival would change everyone's destiny. Ezra Blackwood was fixing the corral fence when he spotted the carriage approaching. At 32 years old, he carried on his broad shoulders the weight of keeping Hope Ranch running alone since his father's death 3 years earlier. His calloused hands stopped working when he realized the stagecoach wasn't heading toward town, but coming directly to his property. "Must be a mistake," he murmured to himself, removing his worn leather hat to wipe the sweat from his forehead. His blue eyes, faded by sun and sorrow, followed the vehicle until it stopped right in front of the main gate. The coachman, an elderly man with a grizzled beard, climbed down heavily and consulted a yellowed paper. "Hope Ranch? Ezra Blackwood?" "That's me," Ezra replied, approaching with cautious steps. He wasn't expecting visitors, much less deliveries. "I have a delivery for you, sir," said the coachman, heading to the stagecoach door. "Came straight from Boston." Ezra frowned. Boston. He didn't know anyone in Boston. He didn't know anyone anywhere, actually. Since Sarah had died of typhoid fever, he had isolated himself from the world, dedicating himself only to the hard work that kept his sanity. The stagecoach door opened and a small gloved hand appeared. The coachman helped the passenger down, and Ezra felt as if the ground had moved beneath his feet. She was a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, with brown hair pinned in an elegant bun under a navy blue traveling hat. Her dress, clearly expensive and inadequate for the Texas climate, was wrinkled from the long journey, but she still maintained a dignified posture. What caught Ezra's attention most were her eyes, green as the prairies after rain, but carrying a determination that contrasted with her delicate appearance. "Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice had a refined Eastern accent, but trembled slightly. "My name is Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield. I believe you were expecting me." Ezra opened and closed his mouth like a fish out of water. "Ma'am, I think there's been a mistake. I wasn't expecting anyone." Margaret consulted a folded letter she took from her purse. "I have here a correspondence from Mr. Joshua Blackwood, dated March of this year, confirming our arrangement." The name hit Ezra like a punch to the stomach. Joshua Blackwood was his older brother, who had left for the East 5 years earlier in search of business opportunities. Since then they exchanged letters sporadically, but Ezra knew of no arrangement. "May I see that letter?" he asked, extending his hand. Margaret hesitated for a moment before handing over the document. Ezra read quickly and his face paled. The letter, written in Joshua's unmistakable handwriting, spoke of a matrimonial arrangement beneficial to both parties, and mentioned Hope Ranch as a prosperous property in expansion. "My brother," Ezra began, but was interrupted by the sound of approaching hooves. 3 riders emerged from the main trail, and Ezra immediately recognized Silas Hartwell, the richest and most influential man in Redemption Creek. Hartwell owned half the county's land and the only operating silver mine. Beside him rode his 2 sons, Thomas, the older one, known for his violent temper, and Benjamin, younger and considered the smarter of the 2. "Well, well," said Silas, dismounting with the arrogance of someone who considers himself owner of the world. "Looks like we have an unexpected visitor in our little community." Ezra felt his muscles tense. Silas Hartwell had tried to buy Hope Ranch several times in recent years, always with insultingly low offers. Ezra's constant refusal had created palpable tension between the 2 men. "Mr. Hartwell," Ezra greeted coldly, "this is private property." Of course," Silas laughed, but his eyes were fixed on Margaret. "I just came to welcome our new neighbor." News travels fast in a small town, especially when it involves such a distinguished lady. Margaret straightened her shoulders, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Sir?" "Silas Hartwell at your service," he said, removing his hat with an exaggerated bow. "I'm the owner of Hartwell Mine and most of the land in this region. If I may observe, a lady of your evident refinement seems to have lost her way." "I'm not lost," Margaret replied firmly. "I came to Hope Ranch as arranged." Thomas Hartwell, a corpulent man of about 25, gave a harsh laugh. "Arranged? With Ezra?" He looked at the rancher with disdain. "Ma'am, I think someone sold you a lie. This place can barely support 1 person, let alone 2. "Thomas," Silas warned, but there was amusement in his voice. Ezra stepped forward, fists clenched. "I think you'd better leave." "Easy, Blackwood," said Benjamin, the younger Hartwell. Unlike his brother, He had a more refined appearance and spoke with an education that contrasted with the typical roughness of the region. "We just want to help. If there's been some misunderstanding, perhaps we can clarify." "There's no misunderstanding," said Margaret, surprising everyone with the firmness of her voice. "I came to marry Mr. Joshua Blackwood and help with ranch administration." A heavy silence fell over the group. Silas was the first to break the silence with laughter that echoed across the property. "Joshua Blackwood?" he repeated, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. "My dear lady, Joshua Blackwood left here years ago and never returned. And as for this prosperous ranch," he gestured to the modest facilities around them, "well, I think your eyes can see for themselves." Margaret looked around for the first time since arriving. What she saw made her swallow hard. Hope Ranch was, at best, modest. The main house, though solid, needed obvious repairs. The barn was in reasonable condition, but the corrals showed signs of heavy use and limited maintenance. There were no signs of the prosperity mentioned in Joshua's letter. Margaret began, but her voice failed. Ezra saw the realization spreading across her face and felt a mixture of anger and compassion. Anger at his brother for creating this impossible situation, and compassion for the woman who had traveled thousands of miles based on a lie. "Miss Thornfield," he said softly, "I think we need to talk." "Indeed," agreed Silas, remounting his horse. "And when you're done talking, my offer to buy this property still stands, Blackwood. Maybe now you'll see the wisdom in accepting." He touched the brim of his hat toward Margaret. "Ma'am, when you tire of this situation, you'll always be welcome at the Hartwell house. A lady of your quality deserves much more than this place can offer." The three men departed, leaving a cloud of dust and tension in the air. The coachman, who had observed the entire scene in silence, cleared his throat. "Sir, I need to return to town before nightfall. The lady's luggage." "Leave it here," said Ezra, taking some coins from his pocket. "Thank you for the trip." When the stagecoach disappeared down the trail, Ezra and Margaret were alone, the silence between them heavy as the air before a storm. "Mr. Blackwood," Margaret finally spoke, her voice controlled but tense. "It seems we've both been victims of deception." Ezra nodded slowly. "My brother, he was always a dreamer. But I never thought he'd go this far." Margaret looked at her luggage piled in the red dust, then at the simple house before her. "I spent all my savings on the trip. I sold everything I had in Boston." Her voice began to tremble. "I have nowhere to go." The confession hit Ezra like a physical blow. He looked at the woman before him, clearly educated, refined, completely out of place in that harsh environment, and felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. "Miss Thornfield," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect, "I can't undo what my brother did, but I can offer temporary shelter while we figure out a solution." Margaret studied him for a long moment. There was something in his blue eyes, a raw honesty, a deep pain, but also a fundamental kindness that reassured her. "I accept," she said simply. "And Mr. Blackwood?" "Thank you." As Ezra carried her luggage to the house, neither of them noticed the figure watching from the nearby hill. Thomas Hartwell had returned alone, and his eyes gleamed with a malice that promised nothing good. Margaret Thornfield's arrival at Hope Ranch had set in motion forces that would change not only their lives, but the destiny of all Redemption Creek. And as the sun set over the arid lands of Texas, the seeds of a drama involving love, betrayal, revenge, and redemption were already beginning to germinate in the red dust of the Old West. Margaret's first night at Hope Ranch was a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. The distant howl of coyotes, the creaking of the houses wood adjusting to the night cold, and the profound silence that only exists far from civilization. She had insisted on sleeping in the small guest room, politely refusing Ezra's offer to give up his own room. Lying on the narrow bed, looking at the wooden ceiling through the pale moonlight filtering through the curtainless window, Margaret reflected on the chain of events that had brought her there. In Boston, she had been Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, daughter of a respectable merchant, educated in the finest schools, destined for an advantageous marriage to some gentleman of society. But her father's sudden death had revealed devastating debts, and Joshua Blackwood's marriage proposal had seemed like divine salvation. Now she was just a lost woman in a place that seemed to exist at the end of the world. On the other side of the thin wall, she could hear Ezra moving through the house. He had been kind but reserved during the simple dinner he had prepared: beans, stale bread, and strong coffee. There was a deep sadness in him, something that went beyond the embarrassing situation created by his brother. Margaret finally fell asleep to the sound of wind whispering through the window cracks. Ezra couldn't sleep. Sitting on the front porch, he watched the stars and tried to process the day's events. Joshua's letter was folded in his pocket, and he had read it several times, looking for clues about his brother's true intentions. Dear Ezra, the letter said, I hope this letter finds you well and prosperous. I have the pleasure of informing you that I have arranged a marriage that will be beneficial to both parties. Miss Margaret Thornfield is a lady of excellent character and education, and I believe she will be a valuable addition to Hope Ranch. She will arrive in September, and I trust you will receive her with the hospitality characteristic of the Blackwood family. What bothered Ezra most was the last line. This arrangement will solve many of our problems, brother. Trust me. What problems was Joshua trying to solve? And why had he described the ranch as prosperous when he knew very well about the financial difficulties Ezra faced? The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Margaret had come out of the house, wrapped in a shawl, and was approaching hesitantly. Can't sleep either? She asked, her voice low in the night's quietude. It's not common to have company, Ezra replied, gesturing for her to sit in the rocking chair beside his. Margaret settled in, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. Mr. Blackwood, I need to ask some questions and I hope you'll be honest with me. You can ask. What's the true financial situation of the ranch? Ezra sighed deeply. It's not good. I've managed to keep things running, but I can barely pay basic expenses. Last year's drought killed half the cattle and beef prices have fallen. And your brother? When was the last time you had contact? I receive a letter from him every few months. The last one was in June. He never mentioned you or any marriage arrangement. Margaret was silent for a moment, processing the information. Mr. Blackwood, may I be frank? Please. In Boston, I was in a desperate situation. My father died leaving enormous debts and I was about to lose everything. When I received your brother's proposal, it seemed an answer to my prayers. She laughed bitterly. What irony. Miss Thornfield, Ezra began, but she interrupted him. Margaret, if we're going to be stuck in this situation together, at least temporarily, we can dispense with excessive formalities. Margaret, he repeated, liking the sound of the name. I'll find out what my brother was thinking. And I'll find a way to help you return east if that's what you want. And if I don't want to return? The question caught him by surprise. What do you mean? Margaret looked at the stars, so bright and numerous they seemed unreal to someone accustomed to Boston's polluted skies. Maybe this is an opportunity to start over. To be someone different from who I've always been. Before Ezra could respond, the sound of approaching horses made them stand. It was too late for social visits, and in the Old West, nighttime visitors rarely brought good news. 3 figures emerged from the darkness, and Ezra immediately recognized Sheriff Tom Bradley and 2 of his deputies. Bradley was an honest man, but was clearly under political pressure from the Hartwells. Ezra, the sheriff greeted, dismounting. Sorry to bother you at this hour. Sheriff Bradley. Any problem? Well, I've received some concerns about your situation here. Bradley looked uncomfortably at Margaret. Some people in town are questioning the propriety of an unmarried lady staying here without adequate supervision. Ezra felt anger rising in his chest. What people? That doesn't matter. What matters is we need to resolve this situation in a way that preserves everyone's reputation. Margaret stepped forward. Sheriff, I can speak for myself. I'm an adult woman, and my presence here is completely appropriate given the circumstances. Ma'am, with all due respect, appearances matter in a small community like ours. So what are you suggesting? Asked Ezra, his voice dangerously low. Well, there are some options. The lady could stay in town at Mrs. Murphy's boarding house. Or, Bradley hesitated. Or you could formalize the arrangement that brought the lady here. Marriage, said Margaret, not as a question but as a statement. It would be the simplest solution, Bradley admitted. Reverend Patterson could perform the ceremony tomorrow. Ezra looked at Margaret, trying to read her expression in the faint moonlight. This decision isn't mine alone to make. Nor mine, she replied. But perhaps we should consider all options. The sheriff seemed relieved. Think about it. I'll return tomorrow for an answer. After the men left, Ezra and Margaret were alone again on the porch. A marriage of convenience, Margaret murmured. Not exactly how I imagined my life. Nor I, Ezra admitted. But maybe we could make it work. As partners, I mean. Not as, well, you understand. Margaret studied him in the dark. There was something about him that intrigued her, a quiet strength, an integrity that contrasted dramatically with the men she had known in Boston. Mr. Blackwood. Ezra, she corrected herself. If we did this, what would be the terms? Terms? Yes. It would be a business arrangement, correct? I would help with the ranch, you would give me a home. But as for the personal aspect of marriage, Ezra blushed, grateful for the darkness. It would be as you wished. I wouldn't expect anything you weren't willing to give. The raw honesty in his voice touched something deep in Margaret. And if, over time, things changed between us? Then we'd deal with that when the time came. Margaret was silent for a long moment, weighing her limited options. Returning to Boston meant facing financial ruin and social humiliation. Staying in town as a local curiosity wasn't appealing. But marrying a stranger? There's something you should know about me, she said finally. I'm not the delicate lady I appear to be. I can read, write, and do accounts. I helped my father with business before he died. I'm not afraid of hard work. And there's something you should know about me, Ezra replied. I'm not good with pretty words or romantic gestures. But I'm a man of my word. If I say I'll protect and respect you, you can count on it. Margaret extended her hand. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Blackwood? Ezra took her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip. We have an agreement, Miss Thornfield? Neither of them noticed that, hidden behind the barn, Thomas Hartwell had observed the entire conversation. His eyes gleamed with an anger that promised future trouble. The next morning, news of the impending marriage spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire in dry grass. In Murphy's barbershop, in O'Malley's saloon, in Peterson's general store, everyone had an opinion about the situation. She was sent to the wrong ranch, the gossips laughed. What an embarrassing situation. But when Ezra entered the saloon that afternoon to get supplies, and heard the laughter and malicious comments, something inside him broke. He stood slowly, his imposing presence gradually silencing the room. You can laugh all you want, he said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised even himself. But I see things differently. Maybe she wasn't sent to the wrong ranch. Maybe God finally sent her to us. The silence that followed was absolute. Ezra placed money on the counter, took his supplies, and left, leaving behind a room full of people reconsidering their opinions. Because, for the first time in 3 years, Ezra Blackwood had spoken about God without bitterness. And everyone who knew him knew that meant something fundamental had changed in the man who had lost faith the day he buried his first wife. The wedding was set for the next day, and Redemption Creek would never be the same. The morning of the wedding dawned with an unusual stillness that seemed to hold its breath over Redemption Creek. Margaret stood before the cracked mirror in the guest room, adjusting the simple white dress she had hastily altered from one of her traveling gowns. Her hands trembled slightly as she pinned a small wildflower, the only decoration available, to her hair. Outside, she could hear Ezra moving around the house with purposeful steps. He had risen before dawn to tend to the animals and make the place as presentable as possible for the few guests who would attend. The ceremony would be simple, held in the small church at the edge of town, with only Sheriff Bradley, the Reverend, and perhaps a handful of curious townspeople in attendance. As Margaret made her final preparations, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Margaret. Ezra's voice was gentle but uncertain. There's someone here to see you. She opened the door to find a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. The stranger held a small bouquet of prairie flowers and wore a warm smile. I'm Martha Patterson, the Reverend's wife, the woman said. I thought you might like some flowers for your special day and perhaps some company while you prepare? Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. That's very thoughtful of you, Mrs. Patterson. Please come in. As Martha helped her with the final touches, the older woman spoke softly. I know this isn't a conventional courtship, dear, but I've watched Ezra Blackwood for years. He's a good man who's carried too much sorrow alone. Perhaps you're exactly what he needs and he what you need. I hope so, Margaret whispered. I truly hope so. The ceremony itself was brief but surprisingly moving. Ezra stood at the altar in his best shirt and jacket, his hair neatly combed and his boots polished to a shine. When Margaret walked down the short aisle, their eyes met and held, and something unspoken passed between them. Not love, not yet, but a mutual respect and determination to make their unusual union work. Reverend Patterson's words were simple but heartfelt. Marriage is not just about passion or convenience, but about two souls choosing to walk life's difficult path together, supporting each other through whatever storms may come. When they exchanged simple gold bands, Ezra's father's ring for him, and one hastily purchased from the general store for her, Margaret felt the weight of commitment settle around her like a protective cloak. You may kiss the bride, the Reverend announced. Ezra hesitated, then leaned forward and placed a gentle, respectful kiss on Margaret's cheek. It was chaste, appropriate, and somehow more meaningful than any passionate embrace might have been. As they signed the marriage certificate, neither noticed Thomas Hartwell watching from the church's back pew, his face dark with an emotion that went beyond mere disappointment.